Shmulik מביא הכל מניו יורק.
New York.
All right. Good evening, gentlemen. We are still proceeding through chapter 2 of the second part of the Tanya.
Just say Shmulik and he shows up.
But empty ends, I don't know. So empty ends, the trunk.
Oh, awesomeness.
Also
See? I knew I came out to get something. Good to see you too.
I can check your
I apologize for disturbing you.
No problem at all. We were disturbed before you got here.
I promise you we're going to save.
We're naturally disturbed.
I have nothing to do with that.
We are making our way through the second chapter of the second part of the Tanya, in which the Alter Rebbe is explaining to us, according to understanding, according to logic, he's explaining to our minds this idea that the world is really only an expression of godliness. And that's really all that the world is. God speaks the world into existence. The fact that the world is here and what the world is and each and every creation in it is all dependent entirely upon God. So that if God were to stop speaking the world into existence, even for a moment, it would totally cease to exist. So what the world really is an expression of God. The world is God's speech. And we're explaining this in a way that we can understand it. What's the explanation? The fundamental explanation, the nakuda, the one point of this explanation, is that we have to understand that God creates the world in a very different way than a human being creates an artifact or an object, or really anything is the truth, any human creation. Because when God creates the world, he creates it something from nothing. When man creates something, man creates always something from something. Says the Alter Rebbe, when man creates, it is not really creation. Really, when man creates, man is really only changing the form of the thing that he is creating. So he takes a lump of silver and he melts it down and he forms it into a menorah. And where was the menorah before he created it? It was a potential within the silver. And since the silver was a given, since the silver existed before the craftsman came, before the silversmith came and made it into a menorah, made it into a form, therefore, even after the craftsman makes it into a menorah, the craftsman can go walking in the shuk, and the object remains exactly as it was when he was forming it. In other words, his constant involvement in the formation of this object or of this artifact is not necessary. The reason why his constant involvement is not necessary is because all he really does is bring out a potential for the silver to be a menorah. The potential existed before he was there. The actuality exists now that he brought it out of potential. But the silver, the silver is the same. The silver was before he got there, and the silver is now after he's there. It's just being in a different way. The way the silver is no longer as a lump of silver. Now it's in the form of a menorah. Therefore, all he's really doing is changing the form, bringing out a potential form and making it actual. When God creates from nothing. Nothing has no potential to be anything. And therefore, when God creates, he is not relying on a pre-existing thing, like a pre-existing material like the silver which is given to him. There is no pre-existing material. There is no pre-existing reality. He creates the world literally from nothing. And therefore, when he creates it, it demands his constant involvement to create. That's really what creating something from nothing means. It demands his constant involvement because otherwise it would totally cease to exist, because its entire existence in the first place is totally derivative of his power. There is no pre-existing, there is no given existence. He is what is making it exist in its entirety. That we really said 2 weeks ago. Last week we went into the Alter Rebbe's metaphor for this idea. The Alter Rebbe gives us a metaphor in the text of the Tanya for understanding the way that God creates and to demonstrate that God's creation must be constant. It must be a constant act of speaking the world into being. which is really another way of saying that the world has no existence whatsoever outside of God's expression. What's the metaphor the Alter Rebbe gives? The Alter Rebbe gives the metaphor of the splitting of the sea. The splitting of the sea, we say that God, the Jews are standing on the Hebrews are standing on the shores of the sea, and God made an easterly wind blow the whole night, and the wall stood like a neid and a chema, which are two different words for wall, and they were able to pass through, and then at the end of the night, the wind stopped blowing, and the waters fell back and flowed naturally as they are within the natural bounds of the sea. So here's the metaphor. The metaphor is the universe is the standingness of the water as a wall. It is the water standing as a wall that is the universe. God is God, and the speech of God, or the energy that is invested in creating the universe, is, at least initially, as so it appears at the simple level, the easterly wind that is blowing the whole night. So you have God, you have a constant easterly wind. The constant easterly wind is making the water stand up like a wall. And the existence of the wall, of the standingness as a wall of the water, is entirely dependent in every moment on God's involvement. If God were to cease to make it stand like a wall for even a moment, the water would return to its nature and would return to flow down naturally. This is the metaphor. And the point is that the splitting of the sea is not like the making of the artifact of the craftsman, right? The Alter Rebbe has to use a somewhat worldly metaphor because those are the only metaphors we understand. But on the other hand, there is no such thing as yesh ma'ayin, as something from nothing in the world in a regular sense, right? The world is entirely something from something as a rule. So the metaphor has to be interesting. The metaphor is obviously not going to be a perfect metaphor because there isn't really any something from nothing in the world. But the Alter Rebbe uses something which is close. And the main point he's demonstrating is that the splitting of the sea is not like making the menorah from the silver. They're fundamentally different because the silver has a potential to be a menorah that the craftsman brings out, but water has no potential to stand like a wall. And that's the fundamental point. The point is that God makes it stand like a wall, but the standingness as a wall is not something that the water has any connection to or any potential for on its own. It is totally external to the water, which is why God must constantly make the water do this. As opposed to a craftsman who makes a silver vessel, he does not constantly have to be involved because all he does is bring out a potential. So God is introducing essentially something totally foreign to the nature of the water to the water, and therefore his involvement is constant the whole night. And as soon as his involvement ceases, the water returns and flows back into its shores. Now, we touched on last week that the reason the Alter Rebbe, first of all, it's strange that the Alter Rebbe uses a metaphor of a miracle because the entire chapter is directed toward heretics who don't believe in miracles. Right, so that's immediately a red flag. How can you use a miracle to prove to someone who doesn't believe in miracles? And the answer is that really the reason this is used is really to answer a different type of problem in a way. Again, we assume that the heretics are not actual heretics who don't believe in miracles, but rather our own hearts that have gone astray and that have lost touch with the fundamental tenets of the unity of God and God's unity with the universe. What might we think? We might think that there is no real way of proving that God creates the world according to the rules of logic. Right? Again, this actually touches on the various arguments that we had 2 weeks ago. Because the whole point was, the Alter Rebbe is explaining something that God does according to logic. The Alter Rebbe is saying, given that God creates the world something from nothing, therefore we must conclude that the method of this creation is constant involvement. If you understand what something from nothing means, it logically entails and logically necessitates that God must be constantly involved. To which someone might reply, if they're very religious, as opposed to a heretic, they're so religious they bend back around to heresy again, which is an interesting idea. They're so religious that they say, how can we say that God does it this way? After all, God is not bound by the laws of logic. Maybe he creates the world something from nothing, and then decides, I'm not going to do it in the way that makes sense and the way it must be according to logic and seichel and reason, and instead I'm going to create it in a way that it doesn't need my constant involvement, and I can have two opposites, I can have a contradiction because I'm God and I said so. Right? Therefore, the Alter Rebbe brings a metaphor from the Torah. The Alter Rebbe says, we cannot, it is true, really say what God must do according to pure reason, pure logic from the way the world works. We can't say that something from nothing and God's non-involvement don't make sense and therefore God can't do it. From Chassidus' perspective, you cannot be so categorical, God can do anything. God exists truly. Logic and reason are truly creations of God. God exists beyond those boundaries. So how do we know that the logical argument even applies to God? In this case, the answer is because in the Torah, where God tells us his own truth through revelation, the Torah tells us things about God. God tells us things about himself. Torah's emes, the Torah of truth. And God says that when he does a miracle, such as the splitting of the Red Sea, the splitting of the Sea of Reeds, the Yam Suf, he doesn't do it in such a way that he adds a totally external nature to the water, and the water stands like a wall, and then God leaves it alone for the rest of the night, and then at the end of the night he changes it back to its regular nature. Instead, it says that God made the wind blow the whole night, and the seas were made to stand like a wall with God's constant involvement the whole night. So in other words, the reason why we use the metaphor from Kriyas Yamsuf, from the splitting of the sea, even though it is a miracle that really only happened one time, more or less.
2 times.
That's neither here nor there. More or less one time. The reason why we would use this strange example is because without an example from Torah, we can't really say anything about God. But since we now have an example from Torah of God doing something very much like creation, yesh me'ayin, therefore, we can say that God himself revealed to us, God himself told us that when I do this creation, when I add something totally yesh me'ayin to a creation, it is in such a way that the world is constantly created. Now, of course, when God changes the nature of the water, it's not really a true yesh me'ayin because the water already exists, which is a point that I hope to talk more about later today, God willing, because the Alter Rebbe says that it's in the way of a kal v'chemer. The water is different than creating the universe, but if this is how God does it with the splitting of the sea, all the more so it must be the way that he does it with the universe, as we're going to see. Okay, that's the review of one thing we spoke about last week.
Is there any commentary, if you go back a few chapters in Shemot, the turning of the staff into a snake and back?
No, not that I know of. No real connection. But one second, we'll get to something like that in a minute. We'll get to that in a minute. We'll get to something like that in a minute. So, another thing we spoke about last week, which is important to mention for the people that weren't here, is that there is another famous metaphor which the Alter Rebbe does not use here for reasons that should now seem obvious, because it's a metaphor just from worldly experience and therefore could not be used to prove anything about God. But nevertheless, it's important to go over it and important to mention it because I'll probably be mentioning it again. And as we're going to go down the rabbit hole, and we're going to get a more and more refined and more subtle understanding of what it is the Alter Rebbe is saying, we're going to need all the help we can get. So we're going to have at least 2 metaphors. Okay? The second metaphor, which is brought elsewhere in Chassidus, but is not brought here in the Tanya, again, because it can't prove anything about God from just worldly things. Metaphor that's brought elsewhere in Chassidus is of a rock that is thrown into the air, is the famous metaphor. A person takes a rock in their hand, or a baseball, or whatever you like, any naturally non-flying object. A rock is a good one, and he throws it into the air. what's the metaphor? The metaphor is that the flight of the rock is the universe in the metaphor. The flight of the rock continues only as long as the energy that the person invests in it with their arm continues to carry it upward. As soon as countervailing forces such as gravity deplete that energy, the rock immediately falls back to the earth. Right? So the God is the person. The speech, so to speak, is the energy that's invested by the arm into the rock, and the flight of the rock is like the universe. And again, as you can see, it's the same type of metaphor. The rock, unlike silver to become a menorah, the rock has no potential whatsoever to fly. As I mentioned last week, if you were sitting on the third floor of a building just looking out the window and you saw a rock fly upward, no one would think, oh look, a flying rock, right? That's not what you think. What you think is what happened down there, what sent that upward, right? Because the nature of the rock is not to fly. The flight of the rock is entirely imposed upon it from the outside. And therefore, that as soon as that outside imposition runs out, the rock immediately falls back to the ground. Yeah. Okay. So, similar metaphor, as you can see. Therefore, when God creates the universe, which is also a something from nothing, He is creating something out of nothing, which has no potential to be something. Therefore, His involvement must be constant. It is the nature of the universe, so to speak, to return to nothing, which is another point that we're going to talk about more this week. Okay, I have to move on to the second thing we spoke about last week. We're doing an in-depth review here. The second thing we spoke about last week is the language of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe says two words from which we read a whole, from which with Rabbi Yoel's help we learn out a whole limud, a whole understanding in what the Alter Rebbe is saying here. What the Alter Rebbe says is that the waters of the sea, because remember, the Alter Rebbe can quote whatever he wants, right? The Alter Rebbe can use whatever language he wants in describing his metaphor. The Alter Rebbe says that the eastern wind blew, and the water stood kaneid ukechema, like a naid and a chema. There's two words for wall. Why are there two words for wall? Is the $1,000,000 question. The Alter Rebbe could have just said like a wall, one word. Instead, he uses two different words. And the answer is really there were two different miracles in making the water of the sea stand like a wall. And not just are there two, but in order for the Alter Rebbe's explanation to be a metaphor, to be a mashal, for the creation of the universe, something from nothing, there must be both aspects of this miracle. There have to be both. If you only had one, it would not be a mashal. It would not be a metaphor. The naid and the chema, respectively, the two different walls, are two different stages in the miracle. The first stage is when God made the wind blow, and the wind actually held up the water like a wall. The second stage of the nes, which this is implied by various midrashim and the text as well, which I won't go into that aspect of it. So in other words, it's not just the Alter Rebbe is making it into two stages for the metaphor. This is actually, in other words, this is actually mashma. This is implicit in all of the details. Yeah, exactly. All such. Yeah. It didn't blow the people. It couldn't blow the sea into 12 different paths. There's all sorts of interesting things that it says about the splitting of the sea that are not explained by the wind, by one eastern wind blowing. Yes. So there's really a second miracle. The first miracle is that the wind blows the water into place. The second miracle is that God actually changed the nature of the water such that it should be wall-standing water. It should be water that stands upright as well. So there was both a wind holding it up, and there was also the inherent nature of the water changed so that it would stand like a wall. And I'm going to explain to you why, as I explained last week. Because really we're going to continue and go deeper into this idea, into this subject with the rest of our time this week, God willing. So the question was, as I said last week, Why couldn't the Alter Rebbe use as a metaphor, he could use water or coffee in a cup as his metaphor, right? You have coffee that's held in a cup, right? Look, the coffee is standing up like a wall, right? It's not lying flat on the table as it naturally would. It's being held up in a wall by the coffee. And if the wall of the cup were to break, even for a moment, the coffee immediately spills out and lies back down, right? Why couldn't this be the Alter Rebbe's metaphor? It has to do the splitting of the sea, such a lofty and high thing. Water sitting in a cup, right?
No, because the cup, this is the purpose of the cup.
No, that's not why. It has nothing to do with the cup. It has to do with the water.
Right, but
If you blow into it, I didn't hear it, but I would imagine if you blow, if anything else blew into the water, it would just dissipate. It wouldn't stand up.
Why?
No, it has nothing to do with any of that. The answer is that the water in the cup is not a metaphor for God's creation of the universe, something from nothing, because the water in the cup does not have a changed nature at all. The cup is acting on the water only externally. Only externally. The nature of the water is not changed. Therefore, it is not a metaphor of creating something from nothing. In the metaphor of creating something from nothing, we need something that has no potential to be the thing into which it is transformed. And it is made to do something for which it has no potential, like the rock flying up in the air. The rock has no ability to fly in the air, and externally imposed upon the rock is the flight up into the air.
Actually, I think differently.
Okay. The water in the cup is still flowing naturally, in other words. The water in the cup is really unchanged. The water is exactly the same. Nothing has really been altered about the water. There's been no actual, no potential has been actualized, really, and no, I guess maybe that's a little debatable, but no major change has taken place within the water at all. This is not a metaphor for creating the universe something from nothing. In fact, it's almost the opposite of the metaphor, right? The waters in the cup is really not any form of creation whatsoever. Or if it is, it's a very, very, very attenuated and distant sense, even of formation. It's not even the artisan forming something into a shape. Because really, it's not even a potential of the water is being brought out. It just happens to be in a different place that is containing it. Exactly as the seabed holds the water, so now the cup holds the water. There's really very little difference. The entire point of it is that we are looking for something which is a metaphor for more than what the artisan does when he brings the potential out of the silver to attain a shape. We are adding something entirely new, a dimension that wasn't there. Therefore, the Alter Rebbe brings the second aspect of the miracle as well, which is that not only did the wind blow, which the wind acts just like more or less like a cup, right? It so to speak shapes the water just as the seabed does, except it happens to be wind instead of sand or whatever, or dust or whatever it is. And instead, the wind blows, but God also changed the nature of the water that the water should actually stand. And the truth is, that aspect, that second aspect, is the metaphor for God's creating something from nothing. Right? Now we asked, so as we asked last week, why would the Alter Rebbe bring both of them? Why does he also need the wind blowing? He could say instead of kanedu kachema, he could just say kachema. He could just say the second one, where God changes the nature of the water. And really this connects to what Barry said about the changing of the staff. Rabbi Yoel actually used a different example of a different miracle. But the example Rabbi Yoel brings is that if we did not have the aspect of the wind blowing the water all night, we might make the mistake and think that the nature of Kriyas Yamsuf, the nature of the splitting of the sea, was the same as the miracle. Really, the staff and the snake is probably identical for this purpose. But Rabbi Yoel brings the example of the sign that Moshe Rabbeinu showed the Jewish people, that he had he took his hand and he put it in his shirt and he pulled it out and it became full of tsaras, full of this impure skin ailment, and then he put it back in his shirt and it was back to a regular and a healthy hand again. Now, in the case of that miracle, this is the point really Rabbi Yoel wants to bring out, that in the case of that miracle, it's clearly the miracle only lies in the moment of transformation. There's nothing miraculous about a hand having a skin ailment. The entire miracle is that it goes from healthy to being completely sick with tsaras, and then back again in just a moment. That's the miraculous aspect. So Rabbi Yoel says is if the splitting of the sea is seen only as God changing the nature of the water, then you might think that God changes the nature of the water at the beginning of the night when the Hebrews have to walk through, and then at the end he changes it back, and in between it's just the nature of the water is holding. In other words, it's not a constant miracle.
Which would go back to the discussion 2 weeks ago, why can't God just create it and walk away?
Exactly. In other words, it would not be describing the way that God actually creates the world, or creates something yesh ma'ayin, a nature in the water that's yesh ma'ayin. Because there would be room to think that God creates the standing nature of the water, something from nothing, and then exactly as Barry says, and then God is uninvolved the rest of the night. God goes to watch The Simpsons, and then at the end of the night he comes back and he transforms the water back into regular water. Right, which there are other examples of miracles like that, as like Moshe putting his hand in his shirt. This is an example of that. So therefore, there has to be this other aspect of the miracle, that God made the wind blow the entire night to change the nature of the water. So really, you have both. The wind was not entirely necessary because in itself, because the nature of the water was changed, and really the changing nature of the water is really the fundamental comparison here to God's creating something from nothing. However, because God wanted to demonstrate that this was his constant involvement, there was also the wind blowing and holding up the water the whole night. Now, really, you have both. You need both of these things for this to be a demonstration of God in the Torah of how he creates something from nothing. Yes, this is what makes it the metaphor that the Alter Rebbe chooses. And this is which in turn is why, and in turn the fact that this is in Torah and the Alter Rebbe is able to choose it is, as I said before, the indication that God is telling us, this is how I do this sort of miracle. God is telling us, I do this sort of miracle of adding something to the water which it has no potential for. I do this in two ways. I change its nature internally, but it is a constant involvement. And from this, the Alter Rebbe learns, so too, when God creates the universe something from nothing, which is the ultimate thing for which there is no potential, there is no prior potential, there is no ability for nothing to become something, so too in that case, when God does it, he creates something, he truly creates it, a total change of nature, and he does it with a constant devotion and involvement. That's the metaphor of the splitting of the sea. Are there any questions so far? That was basically all from last week.
Well, I think just what you said, it's like, two miracles were needed just to prove that everything is working. Because, even though, we're talking about silver and water, each one of them has different potential.
Correct.
The potential of water is actually to take any shape. That's part of the potential of water. So if you put If you put
to take any shape as long as it's the shape of its container is the potential.
Yes and no. Wait.
Yeah.
Yes and no. Because if you take it, then you put it in the freezer. You freeze it. You take out.
Okay, freeze it as ice. Freeze it as ice. It's different.
Not different at all.
No, if you freeze it, it's different because you
think it's different.
It's different.
You change the nature of the water because the nature of the water is to become ice.
And then come back. This is part of the potential of water.
No, ice is something else. Ice is something else.
It's not ice.
If you blew a jet engine...
Ice is something else. We're not talking about ice.
Two miracles were needed. Because if you turn the water into ice from the beginning, it wouldn't change.
We're not talking about ice, though. Where does it say ice? There's no ice.
I don't know. Come on. What do you know?
A wall.
A wall. Maybe it's wall.
Kerach is ice.
Right. No, but the water stands like a wall because it was ice, maybe.
It's not. We're not speculating. We're saying what happened. There's no ice.
It was choma.
I'm telling you what it says. How do we know? How do we know anything about the splitting of the sea? How do we know it even happened at all? Right? From the same place we know that it happened, we know that it wasn't ice.
And my point is, if you took the world's biggest jet engine or turbine fan and blew it into the Yam Suf, the water is not going to go up to a wall. It's going to disperse. It's going to flow back. It's not going to form a wall. It's not going to form a wall.
You look at any shape. If you go to Nazareth in Portugal, you see shapes of waves of over 100 feet. Wave. It's like, believe me, it looks like a wall.
Still.
And they're also just moving backwards.
And then what's two miracles? One is to change the form of it, and then to make it stand like a wall, as you said.
It's the standing.
I don't think there's.
But you don't know what took it to make it to stand like a wall. Maybe it was really frozen to ice.
But there's no ice though.
Say about water.
Right. So ned is the temporary. Choma is the permanent. It doesn't move.
Anyway, there's no ice though. It's not ice. It's water. Ice and water, two different things.
So I was wondering, if somebody stick his hand in standing water, would it get wet?
What do you mean? Oh, it's a good question. No idea.
Another question: did you take a surfboard? 100-foot wave.
It's amazing. I mean, it's like a.
Let's read about 2 lines. About 2 lines in the Tanya we'll read. We are on page 846 in the English. Af shehateva.
Interesting.
Alter Rebbe said that if the wind were to cease to blow, the water would return and flow in its natural state without doubt. Says the Alter Rebbe, even though this nature of water, the nature of water to flow downward, is also created something from nothing, because a wall of stone or ice stands on its own without a wind, and it is simply that the nature of water is not so to stand like a wall. The kol shekain. All the more so with the creation of something from nothing, and is far and away more miraculous and more wondrous than the splitting of the sea. That's all we're going to read inside. So much I know. The Alter Rebbe says as follows. Obviously, the metaphor of making the sea stand like a wall, with its 2 aspects, right, as we've been discussing. Obviously, the metaphor is not the same as creating something from nothing. Obviously not. Because really, what is God doing? God is he is changing the nature of the water, which is really why this is not like yesh ma'ayin. Really, it's like yesh mi-yesh. Because the water and the nature of water to flow already exists. God is taking the water and transforming it into water that stands like a wall. And the truth is that even though that is different than the water's nature, it is truly new, is truly an external imposition to water, because water on its own obviously cannot stand like a wall. Nevertheless, it is still taking place within something that already exists. God is taking water that flows, and He is turning it into water that stands like a wall. Right? This is the sort of the issue here that is being addressed. Because remember, the Alter Rebbe is trying to show us that there is a demonstration in Torah that this is the way that God does such a thing. And a person can come and say, who says there's any connection whatsoever, right? This is not creation, something from nothing. This is I don't know what it is. It's something like something from something. I wouldn't say it's the same as the silversmith, because there the silver actually has the potential to be a menorah. Water has no potential to be a wall. So it's not exactly the same as that. But it's certainly not creation, something from nothing. The water that was there was taken and transformed into different water with different properties. How can you even say that this is a metaphor for creation something from nothing, right? That's the flow of the chapter here. The Alter Rebbe is bevorning. He's bringing up he's answering the objection before it has a chance to arise. The Alter Rebbe is saying, you may object that this metaphor is not really a true metaphor for something from nothing, because, as he says, the nature of water has also created something from nothing. In other words, the nature of water is already there. Yes? Yes. Right. And he says, and so then it's like a conversation, right? In the first line, he's acknowledging the question. The question is, let me restate it, that water already exists, and water has a nature to flow that already exists. And God is, that nature has already been created, Yeshmai. In other words, that nature already exists, and all God is doing is changing the nature, right? So in other words, it's this weird sort of, it's like Ben Hashmashas, right? Nishtahin, Nishtaher. It's not day, it's not night. It's not like making a vessel from silver. Silver has a potential to be a vessel. So there's no constant involvement necessary even, right? It's not like creating literally something from nothing. Nothing has literally no potential to be anything, right? Therefore, logically speaking, if logic is to apply, there must be constant involvement, because there is no prior existence on which to depend. There is no prior existence on which to rely. There's no potential here for this thing to exist. Since there is no potential, it must be constantly created. Yes? The splitting of the sea seems to be sort of somewhere in the middle. The water has no potential to stand. But the water is still the same water. The water has a created nature to flow. God is just changing the nature. So you could say, maybe it's more like the silver than it is like creation something from nothing. And where would that leave us? I don't know. But you can't say this is a metaphor for creating the universe something from nothing, fundamentally. That's what the Alter Rebbe is acknowledging. So then, the Alter Rebbe says, Alter Rebbe says like this: how do we know pardon me. Not how do we know. The Alter Rebbe is saying like this. The Alter Rebbe's reply is as follows. The Alter Rebbe's reply is that it's a kol shekein v'kol v'chemer. This argument really only goes in one direction, right? In other words, it's true that the splitting of the sea is not the same as creation something from nothing. But the only way that this demonstration goes is that creating something from nothing is more of a chidush, is more of an innovation than just changing the nature of the water. Yes? And Alter Rebbe says, let me show you how that's so. He says, that's when he brings up the wall of stone here. He says, the wall of stone can stand on its own. Right? The wall of stone has it in its nature to stand. Why is Alter Rebbe bringing this up here? He's saying as follows. Because you could say like this, right? You could say like this. Here's the counter argument, right? The Alter Rebbe is saying, try and follow me. I know I'm not explaining this in the best way, but try and follow me. The Alter Rebbe is saying like this. The Alter Rebbe is saying that it's a kal v'chomer. If changing the nature of the water and giving it a nature that it doesn't naturally have is something in which God must constantly be involved, kol sheken v'kal v'chomer, all the more so creating something entirely anew. To which the person can respond, maybe the creation of the water is itself, the creation of the standing water is itself a creation, Yeshma.
So it's a different kind of water.
It's new water. It's new water. That's the argument. The person is saying
uncharacteristic water.
He's saying it's water. It's entirely new water.
Heavy water.
Heavy water.
It's water out of its character.
No, but what he's saying is like this. He's saying it's the argument against Alter Rebbe. This is not the case, right? Follow what I'm saying. This is the Alter Rebbe is addressing these potential arguments. What's the potential argument? The potential argument is that the splitting of the sea is not really changing the nature of the water, and as I've been explaining it, and giving it a new nature, which is contrary to what it has the ability to do. Rather, what is actually happening is God is creating new water entirely. God is creating new water entirely, right?
That's an option.
Correct. Perhaps that's what's taking place.
I have a theory how it could happen.
I got it.
Let's put that on ice.
No, it's much better than ice.
And what's the proof? What's the proof that something new that it's something new is being created? The proof that something new is being created is that fundamentally water cannot stand like a wall. Right? That's the proof. Fundamentally, water cannot stand like a wall. You follow? So I'm creating new water. Fundamentally, water cannot stand like a wall. So what was really at standing like a wall, the splitting of the sea, is not water. It's a new heavenly creation. Call it X. X is standing like a wall. It can't be water because water cannot stand like a wall. Right? One second. It cannot stand like a wall. Because so water cannot stand like a wall. So this must be something new. This must be X. 1 second. So therefore, what is happening here is not a metaphor for creation something from nothing, because God is not introducing a new nature into somewhere where it couldn't exist previously. Right? God is not taking water which cannot stand and making it stand. God has replaced the water with something that can stand. Yes? The Alter Rebbe says like this.
No, but it's just like saying it's ice.
The Alter Rebbe says like this.
That new water is...
No, but the Alter Rebbe has even better demonstration. The Alter Rebbe has logical demonstration. The Alter Rebbe says like this. That is not what took place. And how do we know that is not what took place? We know that is not what took place because the nature of water to flow is not fundamental to the mahus of water, to the essence of water, to what makes water what it is. Alter Rebbe says something very subtle here, very subtle. I'm not going to get at all to what I wanted to speak about tonight, by the way. The Alter Rebbe makes the Alter Rebbe makes the point that it is not fundamental in the deepest sense to the water that the water should flow. What's the proof? The proof is that a wall of stones can stand. What's the connection? The Alter Rebbe's point is as follows. The Alter Rebbe's point is that matter per se, right? Matter per se does not necessarily flow like water. Matter can either be standing or can be flowing. Demonstrating that the stuff of the water does not inherently flow or stand, right? It has the potential to do both, so to speak. It has the ability to do both. The stuff of the water. Because the same stuff, chomer, material, that eventually goes on to become water, goes on to become a wall of stones as well. In other words, the point is like this. The point is actually really rather prosaic. It's just I'm making it sound more complicated than it is. There is some stuff that stands. There is other stuff that flows. Therefore, there is nothing about being physical stuff that declares one way or the other. Yes? As opposed to, let me tell you something that being stuff must necessitate. Being stuff necessitates that you take up space. Something that is stuff takes up space. That's inherent to being made of stuff. Yes, to being a physical thing. A physical thing takes up space. Yes?
Sit down, coach.
I don't know why you would even bring that up. Stuff takes up space. So, but the same way, obviously the way that water flows, it does not exist at the same level of necessity inherent to physicality that taking up space does. Taking up space is obviously inherent to physicality because everything that is physical takes up space. Flowing like water, this is Alter Rebbe's point, flowing like water is not inherent to physicality. Therefore, the nature of water to flow is not inherent to the physicality of the water as it is created. Again, the nature of the water to flow is not inherent to the physicality of the water as it is created. Therefore, what does that mean? That means that when God makes water stand like a wall, what is he changing about the water to do that? He's only changing one aspect of the water. He's only changing one aspect of the water. If it were inherent to the water as it is created as a physical object, that it must flow, then you could say that since water cannot stand, it must be that this water was replaced with a new creation. Again, if it is inherent to water, the argument is as follows. If water exists, it therefore must flow. Therefore, God did not make the water stand like a wall. God replaced the water with X, and therefore there is no metaphor here to the creation of the world, something from nothing. Says the Alter Rebbe, the water does not have to flow to the extent that you think it does. Water does not have to flow by dint of the fact that it exists. Not the same way as water takes up space. If water is to exist, it must take up space. But water can exist without having to flow, like we see from a regular wall, a wall of stones. Water can exist, you can exist without having to flow. Therefore, what was changed about the water was only one aspect of the water. It was only a nature, as I've been explaining it the whole class, it was only that God added the nature of standing to the water, but the water, as it was, could continue to exist. There's no reason to say that the water has to be replaced with something new. Flowing is not as inherent to water as the questioner thinks, is what the Alter Rebbe is saying. And therefore, this is what's contained in these 2 lines of Tanya. Therefore, when you look at the metaphor of the water and you say that one aspect was changed and something new, entirely new, for which water has no potential, was imposed externally, this is a metaphor for creation, something from nothing. This is actually a metaphor because there was a new nature that was introduced where there was no potential for that new nature. It wasn't that a new thing was created. It wasn't that X was created, which would be no metaphor. It's that the water was made to do something that the water has no potential to do, but it was still the same water, is what the Alter Rebbe is fundamentally saying.
Gained a new property.
Correct, it gained a new property, exactly. A new property was imposed upon it. And as soon as that imposition was removed, it reverted back to its natural nature. And this is a metaphor for how God creates the universe, something from nothing. And really, there's a wrinkle here which I haven't even mentioned, which will, God willing, be the topic of next week's class. God willing, we'll get into the wrinkle.
So going back to the staff, though.